Good evening. I'm Jennifer Richards, Joseph Cowan Professor of English Literature. Welcome to tonight's Insights virtual lecture, which is being held in association with the Humanities Research Institute. Age of the Techno-Scene, Why We Will Need the Arts and Humanities to Tame the Tiger of the Fourth Industrial Revolution and Artificial Intelligence by Professor Andrew Thompson. I'll be back after the lecture for a live Q&A with the speaker. If you'd like to submit a question, you may do so via the YouTube live chat box on your screen or via Twitter @InsightsNCL. If you are tweeting about the event and want to share your thoughts, please use @InsightsNCL. It's an honour to introduce our speaker this evening, Andrew Thompson, Professor of Global and Imperial History and a Professorial Fellow of Nuffield College, Oxford University. Professor Thompson's research interests span global histories of humanitarianism, human rights and development, the history of modern globalization, and the relationship between globalization and empire. He's completing a book about the modern aid and development sector titled Humanitarianism on Trial for Oxford University Press. Tonight, though, we are going to hear from Professor Thompson on a topic that connects to a different but no less distinguished aspect of his professional life. Over the last 5 years, when he was not busy in the archives of the United Nations, he was the executive chair of the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Among his many achievements in that role was the award of significant funding for the AHRC's Creative Industries Programme as part of the industrial strategy, which enabled and is still enabling a digital transformation in the arts and humanities. I know Professor Thompson as one of the most exciting and forward-thinking advocates for the value of arts and humanities in the 21st century. I hope you enjoy his lecture. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. I was particularly pleased to accept this invitation to speak tonight for two reasons. The first is that when I visited the University of Newcastle, I've always been highly impressed by the research that it conducts across arts and humanities disciplines. But the second is because the invitation came from my colleague and friend, Professor Jennifer Richards, who's pioneered that research in digital transformations in the arts and humanities at the University of Newcastle that she just referred to. So I'm very pleased to be with you. And I want to start by saying that for most of us, the Anthropocene is a familiar refrain. We understand it as an age during which human activity is seen as being the dominant influence on our environment. But if we buy into just a fraction of the claims that are made for the fourth industrial revolution, then the age of the techno-scene would seem to have equal justification. In other words, we're living at a time when a new digital technological revolution, enabling the extraction of data and its transmission in new digital forms, is changing the way we live and work and relate to each other. So the next slide, please. Well, in his book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, Klaus Schwab, who's the founder and executive chair of the World Economic Forum, actually goes as far as to argue that the rapid advances in technology that we're experiencing are changing what it means to be human. To quote Schwab, the changes are profound. There's never been a time of greater promise or potential peril. 3 previous industrial revolutions, to be sure, created major societal changes, but today's transformation is said to be unique unique in terms of the speed with which innovation is taking place and technologies are spreading around the world, unique in terms of the way emerging technological breakthroughs in AI, robotics, nanotechnology, quantum computing are amplifying each other, and unique in how the fusion of these new technologies is blurring the boundaries between the physical, digital, and biological worlds. Moreover, as with earlier revolutions, this new literature on the fourth industrial revolution is shot through with unease regarding how, under the weight of such historic changes propelled by digital power, technology and society can continue to coexist. And that's going to be a theme of my lecture tonight. Next slide, please. So automation, artificial replacing human intelligence, is becoming an emerging concern. And my history colleague and media don Neil Ferguson recently remarked that despite overwhelming evidence of the accelerated pace of technological change, we humans remain chronically bad at making realistic projections of our future. Well, so much for history. But predictions are hard to resist. And citing, if I can have the next slide, please, when Ferguson cites Carl Frey and Michael Osborne at the University of Oxford, he observes that half of the jobs in the United States are at risk over the next decade or two. Labour substitution by machines is exercising our generation as much as it did our Victorian predecessors. So will today's technological innovation destroy some jobs and replace them with others? A recent OECD report argues that a process of creative destruction is going to radically change people's jobs, and that governments of rich as well as poor countries are failing to prepare their workforce. Digital devices are everywhere. 40% of the value of the average automobile is now in the form of digital tech. A combination of globalization and technology is set to put American truck drivers out of work, just as motor cars and railways made horse-drawn carriage drivers redundant a century earlier. And digital technology is posing this question as much for the professional middle classes as it is for manual workers. An Oxford Martin School survey on the automation of professions predicts approximately 47% of total employment to be at risk. Next slide, please. Well, some are a little bit more sanguine about automation. The academic David Graeber is among them. His Times Book of the Week, BS Jobs: A Theory, opines that an awful lot of jobs in our modern economy are nothing short of pointless. A person employed in a BS job, according to Graeber, is a job that is defined as one that the holder knows to be such, but must pretend otherwise. And a person employed in that type of job may be as inclined to see the fruits as much as the faults of automation. Until that is, I would argue, and that AI actually deprives them of a stable basic income and the security that employment, however mundane it may be, brings. An array of algorithms are coming for our jobs, so says the New York Times journalist Kevin Roose, who has just published a book, 9 Rules for the Human in the Age of Automation. For Roose, future-proofing ourselves for the various digital processes that can carry out tasks previously done by humans means not competing with that revolution on its own terms, but leveraging the advantages that humans have over robots. Roose sees these advantages principally as creativity and craftsmanship. But as one reviewer remarks, the reader is much more likely to walk away from Roose's 9 Rules with a sense of foreboding than a sense of survival. And that brings us to the question of what exactly is different about today's big tech revolution. Well, I think the thing that most makes the tech giants of today different is data. Data, their raw material, more or less acquired for free, the trails and troves of which they amass in order to skillfully mine every ounce. Through such data mining, they learn about our patterns of behavior, and they drive their profits by charging advertisers and retailers for what's then revealed. Big data is tilting the playing field decisively in favor of the big tech companies. The lack of ownership of data felt by citizens is exacerbated by the ambiguous status of the so-called FANGs, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google, although you could now add Amazon and Twitter to that list. Before 2008, not one of these companies could be found amongst the world's largest by market capitalization. Today, they occupy first, third, fourth, and fifth places. They're now establishing a dominance over the public sphere, not seen since the heyday of a pre-Reformation or Reformation church. Are they there to make the world a more open and connected place, to provide an indispensable community service, the NGOs of a digital world, if you like? Or are they ruthlessly efficient money-making machines exploiting data-rich environments? To the question of who owns data, add, how should the FANGs be regulated? And by regulation, I mean not simply user privacy concerns, but the exploitation of the economic value of our data and who shares its profits. I also mean media regulation. The FANGs are partly communication companies, which not only connect people, but curate news and opinion in ways that are said to add to a sense of social division. In the constant battle for our attention, they engage us with those who share our view of the world, while sheltering us from those who don't. This is the so-called filter bubble, to borrow a phrase from the writer Eli Parasar. Information now seems almost too valuable to get ethical about. The top 5 tech companies are worth double the entire British economy. It was the dot-com crash of 2000 that actually made markets realize the internet wasn't making money, and that these tech companies then began to see, after that dot-com crash, that information about users was a valuable commodity. So the search engine Google suddenly did a U-turn, and it actually started selling its advertising space after 2000, and the better targeted its adverts, the more Google found they were worth. The next slide, please. The most trenchant attack on today's tech giants is advanced by Shoshana Zuboff in her theory of surveillance capitalism. Big tech companies, she argues, are aggregating behavioral data as a commodity from which they scrape off a valuable surplus. More than that, they're taking our data and its predictive power and monetizing it. For Zuboff, it's not that we failed to rein in this rogue capitalism, we haven't even tried. Quote, surveillance capitalism knows everything about us, but we know little about them. Witness, for example, the growing concern about how China is harnessing the power of big data to buttress the power of the state. China's data-driven economy accounts for 40% of the world's e-commerce transactions. It's the world's leader in payments made by mobile devices. Alibaba, which is China's answer to Amazon, Tencent, the creator of WeChat, JD.com, these are the new retailers of a 21st century consumer revolution. But China isn't just driving shoppers online. The mass of personal data collected through digital transactions allows the Chinese authorities to check up upon an individual's behavior and potentially to penalize those who step out of line. And China's tech companies all have state representatives sitting on their boards, and they're all obliged to share their data with the authorities. For Zuboff, the answer to the conundrum of who controls data lies in the reclaiming of the ownership of data. Everybody able to see who holds their data, how they're using it, and whether they're monetizing it, with a view to then putting an end to what she calls the secret theft of private experience. How exactly in practice this would work, however, isn't clear. The next slide, please. So this brings me back to the Taming the Tiger part of my lecture title. It's my argument tonight that the public discourse surrounding AI and algorithms and machine learning requires the arts and humanities to provide us with three types of insight: historical, ethical, and cultural. To navigate and negotiate our way through this fourth industrial revolution, to grasp its opportunities, spread its benefits, and build public trust in technology, we're going to need the arts and humanities to guide the way. So let's begin with history. Some of us may be experiencing a fourth industrial revolution, but it's worth reminding ourselves that about a fifth of the world has yet to fully experience a second industrial revolution. Nearly 1.3 billion people still lack access to electricity. Charging a phone, let alone owning one, would likely be difficult for them. Approximately 790 million people live without regular access to clean water supply, and an estimated 1.8 billion have no adequate sanitation. Many of those who face extreme poverty and the prospect of famine live in Africa. Yet across Africa, an Afro-tech revolution is also said to be taking place. For some, this provokes fears of a digital recolonization. The basic economic template of Europeans arriving with the power and technology and leaving with the goods and the profits is felt to be at risk of repeating itself. But others are more optimistic. They put their faith in leapfrogging. And this is the idea that Africa can escape its poverty and indeed history by skipping whole stages of development, absorbing the latest technological advances, and adapting them to Africa's circumstances. The next slide, please. The optimists point to things like the invention of M-Pesa in 2007, which is a system for transferring small amounts of money by mobile phone and is now used by about 25 million Kenyans. Next slide, please. At the heart of the equation between big tech and Africa's future development lies the matter of ownership and control. Jumia, which is dubbed the Amazon of Africa, is an e-commerce company. The company claims its listing on the New York Stock Exchange shows Africa's tech revolution has come of age. But at the most senior level, the company is managed by French executives operating out of Paris. The technicians who design and maintain its online systems operate out of Portugal, and many are Portuguese nationals. And meanwhile, much of Jumia's capital is raised in Europe and America. So is Jumia really African? Are old patterns of extraction reasserting themselves today and threatening Africa's homegrown tech industry at birth? Jumia's supporters say that such a rehashing of the colonial past is distinctly unhelpful, if not actively damaging. The next slide, please. Andela, which was formed in 2014, is a software development company training African coders. Its co-founder, Iyinlewuwa Abueji, also flatly rejects the idea of techno-colonialism. In fact, in a world without borders, he sees this primordial debate, that's his words, about what is an African company as nothing short of meaningless. The nature of global capitalism, Abueji argues, is such that no African tech company, outside of South Africa at least, is likely to be incorporated and to raise its own capital. The next slide, please. So this brings me to a second reason for deploying a historical perspective on this fourth industrial revolution. The technology shifts of our generation are intimately and intricately linked to processes of globalization. As Thomas Friedman argues, the move to a digital world where we can analyze and optimize and prophesize and customize is inseparable from the move to a globalized world, a world in which we're not only increasingly interconnected with each other, but interdependent too. Now, if Friedman is right, then understanding the challenges posed by globalization is as vital as understanding the challenges posed by the fourth industrial revolution. They go hand in hand. The latest historical literature suggests different episodes of globalization have tended not only to shift global connectivity to new levels, but to produce highly uneven and irregular patterns of connection. In the past, as well as the present, global economic integration, driven by new technology, brings rising inequalities. Those who benefit have to be set against those who face the burden of adaptation, winners and losers. And this brings me to the phenomenon of technology time lags, by which I mean that the biggest disruptive effects of tech revolutions are arguably not felt at the moment of invention and innovation, but rather displaced into later decades. Technology time lags take two forms. The first form is the actual refinement of the technology. Today, we see this with the ongoing advancement of algorithms and the computing power required to run them. Compared to the 1990s, algorithms are now threatening to replace not just basic, but much more complex human operations. Now, that effect is nicely captured by Brian Arthur in his Nature of Technology, where Arthur refers to a hierarchy of systems with much innovation occurring at lower levels and unfolding over time. Witness aircraft manufacture here. You don't often see new planes on the market now, but you do see continuous modifications of engine technology and aircraft operating systems to improve fuel efficiency. The second form of technology time lag is more political. Governments face decisions regarding how to respond to new forms of wealth and power to which new technology gives rise. For example, today's politicians seem much more willing to tax and regulate GM than they do to tax and regulate digital tech giants. Google tweaks search algorithms to force its way into new markets. It puts its own listings on top and thereby eliminates the competition. So should the onus of antitrust laws be on Google to show how its behavior is actually helping consumers, or should there be onus be on regulators to demonstrate the harm that Google is actually doing? Now, these are emphatically not new questions, so let me illustrate what I mean with regard to 19th century steamship technology. The first Canadian steamship made its maiden voyage to Quebec from Liverpool in 1854. And on its return journey, it's likely that that ship had wheat as part of its cargo, because wheat was used as ballast in steamers coming back to the UK on the so-called North Atlantic run. Yet the mass transportation of wheat from the Canadian prairies to the UK had to wait for another 30 years. It wasn't until the 1880s, when steamships reached a threshold size that made them competitive with the big iron-hulled sailing ships, that steam technology finally spelt a dramatic fall in grain prices and the beginning of the end of the economic power of Britain's landed aristocracy. So that was the first technology time lag. But there was also a second time lag because the politics of new steam technology had to catch up with the science from which that technology was born. States were faced then, as they are now, with the question of what forms of wealth to tax and which not to tax. The taxation of landed wealth in the form of Lloyd George People's Budget actually had to wait until 1909, a further 3 decades after the exposure of English agriculture to intensifying foreign competition. Now, why am I talking about these technology time lags? Because if I'm right, and if the past has anything to teach us here, then the real repercussions of this fourth industrial revolution are most probably still to come. Next slide, please. So much for history. What about ethics? Under the title Algorithms of the World Do Not Unite, the Financial Times journalist and self-named undercover economist, Tim Harford, who's a visiting fellow at my college, speculates on where rapidly growing computing power is taking us. Could we build an app to run a national economy, he asks. Well, Harford is skeptical, but one doesn't need a national economy to demonstrate the pervasive presence of algorithms in our lives. The single most controversial of these algorithms may well be Facebook's newsfeed. Nearly 2 billion people, so about a quarter of the world's population, log on to Facebook every month. An article's position in Facebook's newsfeed depends on algorithms hidden in black boxes and regularly tweaked by software engineers. Many news organizations have altered how and what they report in the hope that their stories will be chosen, in effect, by a piece of software. Despite the ubiquity of these algorithms, people are unable to perceive their presence or comprehend their operation. As a line of code embedded within other technologies, they're silent and invisible. We don't see how they arrive at an answer. We're just offered the end product of their computation. How can you hold to account that which you know nothing about? Well, this takes us to the problem of algorithms trained on deficient data. Awareness is growing of the inadvertent introduction of unjust or irrational bias into algorithms, risks which multiply when the people affected are already in some sense vulnerable, and when more and more of the world's population are being tracked by CCTV cameras. Next slide, please. Witness the negative media coverage surrounding facial recognition software for women or people of colour when that software is trained on biased data sets with too many white men. What happens when data sets faithfully reflect history, but that history is by its very nature unfair? An equally disquieting prospect is presented by a recent algorithm developed at Stanford that can apparently distinguish between pictures of gay and straight men with an accuracy of 80%. What would happen if such software fell into the hands of authorities in places where homosexuality is illegal? The optimism that led some to become starry-eyed about digital technology has certainly been dented. Understanding data to understand bias is a vitally important ethical question for our times. We need robust ethical frameworks to enable us to keep on safely innovating. And diversity is going to be the key to good practice here, by which I mean, first, a diversity of data, cross-checking one data set against another, maximizing the number of perspectives on the question that we're addressing. Second, a diversity of people, ensuring different viewpoints by ensuring a diversity of backgrounds of people on a team, avoiding groupthink from whatever type of group. And thirdly, a diversity of modeling, combining statistical techniques to complement each other and to move towards an aggregate answer. We live in network societies where power resides increasingly in the algorithm. Exercising judgments on the ethics of AI to deliver much needed informed public consent is a subject which I would argue is set to be with us for years to come. And the next slide, please. So finally, I come to culture. How is this seemingly inexorable integration of technology into our lives affecting our inner selves? What will be its impact upon quintessential human capacities like self-reflection or empathy or compassion? What challenges is this proliferation of information, processed at ever greater speeds, posing to human digestion and comprehension? As we watch, we are being watched. Will a way of life where surveillance becomes the norm feel ever more intrusive? Biometrics may help us to monitor our stress levels, but are we really ready to deal with the barrage of personalized information involved? Are we ready for a world of wearable technology? Will some of us prove more psychologically resilient than others with its constant feedback and cognitive load? The iPhone, we might remind ourselves, was launched as recently as 2007. By 2015, there were, give or take, 2 billion users of smartphones, which are fast becoming the primary distribution vehicle for news and other forms of content. Advances in AI, with new forms of demographic segmentation, are poised to transform the world of entertainment. The last 5 years has seen the rapid growth of AI across the creative industries. Algorithms that track and predict our cultural interests are now the norm. Sophisticated users of data can personalize services and target consumers. The audience of the future is predicted to look very different to that of the past. But there's also a widespread assumption that AI can't be creative. For the foreseeable future, the cultural industries are said to be low-risk jobs in terms of automation. Is this true? There are already examples of AI developing creative products, most obviously in the burgeoning gaming industry. And algorithms are handling language with more confidence all the time. Witness Google Translate. So what about writing and journalism? Can AI move from the domains of distribution and production to those of creation and curation? From content recommendations to commissioning decisions? From the generation of music for ads to AI-generated worlds in painting or film? Between Apple and Facebook, the augmented reality race is now firmly underway. The way digital technologies create new immersive experiences and blur the boundaries between virtual and physical worlds is set to provoke new questions about our sense of humanity and how we relate to each other. So that then brings me to my conclusion. What would AI driven from a human rather than a technological perspective actually look like? The machines that propelled the Industrial Revolution were those of muscle power. Those that propel the data science revolution are those of cognitive power. Digital and communication technologies are reaching deeper into our lives. The near ubiquitous presence of data is a key factor behind the big tech revolution of our generation. As data proliferates and processing power is enhanced, more data, more quickly available, more readily accessible, the fourth industrial revolution gathers pace. Do we have the capacity to adapt? The promise and peril of this new technology are in fact two sides of the same coin. So I think we should be asking not what these new digital technology communications will do to us, but what we will do with them. The fourth industrial revolution, in other words, isn't just a technological challenge. Rather, it fundamentally questions how we build societies and communities in which people want to live and feel enabled to contribute and thrive. And that, in turn, means developing the skills to think critically about the purposes to which AI is put. For the 21st century, technology and society not simply to coexist, but to benefit and profit from each other, we would need to embrace historical experience, ethical reasoning, and cultural and intercultural understanding, the foundational reasoning of the arts and humanities, history, ethics, and culture. Together, this triptych will help to ensure that the new technologies of the 21st century can be trusted technologies. Technologies that truly offer the prospect, expressed in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, of a better tomorrow for all. Thank you very much for listening.
Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody back to the Q&A time. I'd like to thank Professor Thompson for a powerful and provocative lecture. I'll be taking questions from the chat, but if I may, I'll perhaps start with my own question just to get us going. So, Andrew, myself and a colleague, Tiago Sousa Garcia, ran an event with school students 2 weekends ago, where we were using AI to support their creativity. So we were using AI to write poetry with. And one of the tests that we set ourselves is whether we could tell the difference between an AI and a human-generated poem. Sometimes we could, sometimes we couldn't. But for the school kids on the day, they saw the AI as a useful tool as a provocation for their own creativity, something to get them started. And I just wonder whether, that's a very benign use of AI. And listening to your lecture has made me wonder about not just what arts and humanities can do in the world of AI, but what we need to do in the arts and humanities to engage with the challenges that lie ahead, and trying to think a bit about not just the benign use of AI to generate creativity, but kind of some of the pivoting our critical thinking. And I wonder whether you've got any thoughts on the future of arts and humanities too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a brilliant question, Jenny, and I'm going to come at it from typically from you, insightful, an incisive question. I'm going to come at it from slightly a side angle and not fully answer it, but because the example you've given is very interesting. So just to rewind a bit, if we did actually have an information and communications technology revolution in the 1970s, we know. So the literature, I think, on the fourth industrial revolution isn't always entirely clear how that 1970s tech revolution is different, yeah, from the one that we've been experiencing in the early 21st century. But insofar as an answer is there, it's mostly around, I think, you tend to get it around machine learning and self-learning AI systems. And we know, for instance, from a company like DeepMind, that the traditional AI programs operated according to sort of hard-coded rules, which restricted them to working within the confines of what was already known. But new AI systems, which are drawing off neuroscience, are actually capable, in principle, of learning on their own from first principles. Now, to come back to your question, I think we posit quite a hard binary between the machine learning of computers under AI and human learning, as if they're entirely different and distinctive things and not going to relate to and ricochet off each other. But the example that you just raised in poetry is quite fascinating, because there was a sort of implication in it that that AI actually might help to stimulate the creativity of humans, not to stifle it. And I don't think that's a possibility that's allowed for very much at all, in the literature. You can sort of see an analog to it, which is the latest headwear that is coming out of the West Coast of the US from Google. Actually, it's not headsets, it's glasses now, where it sort of blurs the real world and the virtual world. And I've actually worn a pair of these headsets for one of those AHRC funded projects, working with the National History Museum and the Science Museum exhibitions of dinosaurs and robots, And it was if it was the most natural thing in the world to have a pair of glasses, that was digitally projecting things on things while you could see at the same time. Now that does raise the question is, will it not be the most natural thing in the world for our human creativity to be sparked and stimulated in some ways, by computers and machine learning? So, I mean, you've given me a really interesting insight to take away and chew on there.
So I'm going to ask another question, if I may. I was really struck by, I'm just checking, I'm really struck by something you said early on in your lecture. And it's about that you suggested that governments are not of richer and poorer countries are not really preparing their citizens for what's coming, their workforces. We're not having sufficient debate in the public domain about what's going on. And I just wonder, sort of asking for sort of, maybe I shouldn't really be asking for sort of insider knowledge about this, but the kinds of discussions that have, you've been part of leading, you were chief executive of AHRC. So there will be many conversations, I'm sure, among our research funders. Your work takes you across disciplinary boundaries. You've sat around the table with scientists. And I just wonder whether this is the problems you're highlighting are part of thinking that you've been party to at UKRI, or whether the government is being encouraged to help people.
Yeah, I'm not that optimistic about that, actually, and I'll tell you why. Is that I'm going to come on in a minute and talk about this book by Richard Baldwin, the Globotics Upheaval. But I think in broad terms, as you know, we government a few years ago introduced an industrial strategy. And that industrial strategy felt far more comfortable with things that were made with goods and manufacturing than it did with the professions and services. Mm-hmm. And many people said, not just in terms of R&D investment, but more broadly, is that the city and financial services, hardly got a look in. Now that may be that after the big crash of 2008, politically the city was out of favour, but I think it was more to it than that. I think we've struggled to get our mind around, what the state should be doing in terms of the future of our professional and service sector economy. Now, why is that relevant here? Well, if you read Baldwin's book, which is a pretty depressing read, he argues, as I was arguing when I quoted the Oxford survey from Colin Frey, that it's not just in previous industrial revolutions, it's mainly been the jobs of manual workers that have been at threat. The argument is that what's about to change is the jobs of professions and services are just as much, if not more, at threat. And the argument in Baldwin is that's for two reasons. They're either going to be put out of work by what he calls white-collar robots, or they're going to be put out of work by what he calls telemigrants. And what's changed is, I think, a mixture of at least three things. The fact that, particularly with the telemigrants, so those who can, do service sector or professional jobs, not from the country we're living in, but from, a country or continent 1,000 miles away, And what's changed is, first, that internet connections, just for many people around the world, are much more stable and reliable than they once were. And I think to a certain degree, despite some of the frustrations of Zoom and Teams, we've seen that in the pandemic. Secondly, language, that actually you can get quite a way with Google Translate software now, to work in languages that you're not particularly familiar with. And then thirdly, just new forms of software like the video conferencing, software that was waiting for us to use before the pandemic, actually. Teams and Zoom were there. We just didn't have a particular. And all of those things mean that actually either these telemigrants or white-collar robots can make inroads into service and professional sector jobs. And the jobs that are predicted to survive are those that most need, human qualities and human intelligence. Now, if you ask me of my verdict on that, I'm not entirely carried by it, every technological revolution comes with a fair degree of hyperbole and alarmism, But there certainly is a subject there to be looked into it. And if the question is a government looking into it, then I'm not so sure.
Yeah. Thank you. We've got some great questions coming in. This question comes from Jan. If we could design a computer to help us to make moral decisions, do you think we should create it? If so, what kind of computer might be best? Should we surrender our moral decision-making to such a machine or remain autonomous? If the latter, how?
Great question. Lots of sort of philosophy and ethics embedded in that. I think on the margins, it may be beginning to happen more than we realize. So a little bit of my lecture I cut out for the interest of time was looking at where algorithms are moving into the professions. They're certainly moving into the law, and they're also moving into medicine. And the moment they make any move into those two professions, you're going to get fairly quickly, into ethical decision-making territory in one way or another. It will be it won't be a very far distance between purely transactional AI in either of those professions, yeah, and AI with ethical implications. Am I for or against that? Well, I'm certainly against it if they're not really strong and ethical, robust ethical frameworks, yeah, to monitor, to oversee, and to regulate it happening. So, you know, in the law, you know, that would be predicated on a judiciary, and I don't want to make too many presumptions, but I suspect if you look at the demographics of a judiciary, yeah, it might not be the most sort of, you know, sort of tech savvy, yeah, of sort of, you know, of all the professions we have. Or if you look in, you know, medicine with our, you know, hospital consultants, yeah, then it will require them having a degree of awareness, I think, of what algorithms do and how they function and how they operate, and, you know, the ethical frameworks that need to be put around them, that I suspect that, you know, our own profession, for instance, in academia, will be largely lacking at the moment. So I think my response would be that before we travel very far down that road, we need to do exactly what I was urging us to do in the lecture, which is to think about, you know, what much more robust, transparent, and ethical frameworks, yeah, around algorithms that are taking decisions that affect our day-to-day lives look like.
Thank you very much. And we've got a question from Jonathan, who asks, which of the arts and humanities disciplines are most likely to grow in importance to meet these challenges of AI and industry for the Fourth Industrial Revolution? Why are they best positioned, and are they any likely to fade away?
That's a brilliant question, really brilliant question. And you know, if I was allowed to give a slightly light-hearted answer, I'd say it has to be history, of course, because I'm a historian, yeah? And, you know, the past is a reservoir from which we can learn. There is a problem with globalization in history, though, and I sort of launched an implicit broadside against it in the talk today, which is that if you think that, you know, all of these tech revolutions are unprecedented, yeah, then actually they cut you off from the past, yeah? They lead you to jettison history, because why would it be relevant, yeah? Because the Fourth Industrial Revolution, we've never witnessed anything like this before, yeah? And the argument would be the Fourth Industrial Revolution is blurring the boundaries, not just between physical and virtual, but biological worlds as well, yeah? So what could we have to learn from the past? So I guess my lecture was, you know, an argument that you might want to look at that as sort of different way. But I actually think that, you know, it's the breadth of the arts and humanities here, because as you know, Jenny, historians have no monopoly on history. History exists in a whole swathe. And although I think philosophers have a particular locus around ethics, I don't think they have a monopoly on it, yeah? And I think when we start to think about cultural understanding, then we're really talking about the length and breadth of the arts and humanities. So I, rather than a light on a discipline, which maybe, you know, look as though I'm sort of ducking or dodging the question, but I'd really like to think about the types of reasoning that we require and types of thinking. And I think if you put it like that, that actually in the midst of this Fourth Industrial Revolution, you know, having a sense of our past, having a historical sensibility, being ethically aware, and having a level of sort of cultural insight and understanding, you know, are sine qua non types of knowledge, then actually, rather than thinking that this is all about tech and all about STEM, and of course it is partly about that, we want to be talking to our, you know, our STEM colleagues, but actually you begin to see that the arts and humanities have a major locus in these debates.
Thank you, thank you. Question now from Mark. Do you think the way we value our personal data has changed over time? And is this the influence of tech companies? The social media generation seem to want to share that information with the world.
Yeah, I mean, that is another really interesting question. And, you know, if it was a different sort of event and we were in person, you know, I would throw one or two questions back at that question, and I'd be interested in their perspective. One of the things that I would have asked them is whether they think the answer to that question might vary demographically. And so, you know, are different age cohorts more or less protective of their data? Certainly, if you look at online opinion surveys, it wouldn't give you a great deal of optimism that people are really hot on protecting their personal data. When there are technological advantages to be had by handing it over, most of us seem willing to do that. And you might know, Jenny, and some of the people listening in might have read relatively recently in the last couple of years that the father, a so-called father of the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee, actually launched a global action plan to save the internet from what he called, sort of political manipulation. And he had a number of things, points that he was making or actions that he was requesting, recommending. But one of them was that in order to build trust online, companies ought to be compelled to simplify their privacy settings by providing control panels where people could access their data easily and manage their privacy options in one place. And I do think that maybe some of the issues around this is that, many of us are a bit lazy online and asked to do something, protect our data when it's going to be not straightforward, it's going to take time, we've got to work out how to do it, is different to actually, having systems that make that just, very straightforward, very quick, and very simple. And that's where I think there might be scope, for state sort of intervention, because I think that we probably are too relaxed about this, and I as the lecture said, I think there are, and I should say, I talked about China, but I'm in no way a xenophobe. I go to China a lot. I think there are, particular problems with the use of technology in China, but one of my Chinese colleagues might remind me that I think per head of population, London has as many CCTV cameras as anywhere else in the world. So, I think these are issues for liberal democracies as much as they are for other types of political system.
Thank you. And we have the final questions just in. This question comes from Kate, and she asks, in your talk, you mentioned Afrotech and leapfrogging. Are there any other countries which are doing this? So leapfrogging the...
that's very interesting. I think what's interesting about a region that, I write on myself historically, which is South and Southern Africa and East Africa, is that some of the most imaginative and creative and forward-looking uses of mobile technology, have been in countries, in that region. And the phrase sort of creative tech, if you went to many parts of Southern and Eastern Africa, it would be understood, because you've got a whole generation of young people, who are sort of, exploiting mobile phone technology. I can remember a director of BT actually saying to me that, there is more imaginative, creative, advanced use of mobile phone technology going on in Southern Africa than in Western Europe. Now, I don't know which other parts of the world that you may or may not find that to be true. It'd be interesting to know, for example, whether the same could be said of certain parts of Latin or South America. But I think the point is here that there is no direct line between the wealthiest, the richest, the sort of so-called most advanced sort of countries, and the most sort of effective exploitation, or cutting-edge exploitation of this sort of technology. So I'm more familiar with the African sort of context and Southern and Eastern Africa, really, and it would be interesting to know whether you could find other parts of the global South for which that was equally true.
Thank you. That's certainly a phrase I hadn't come across, so I was very intrigued to hear about that. Okay, I think that is all we have time for, and I'd like to thank our speaker, Professor Andrew Thompson, and I'd like to thank the audience for watching and let you know about the next event, which will be on Thursday, the 18th of March. The topic is Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hate crime. Why is it rising, and what can be done by Iman Atta? Okay, so we're virtual, so we can't do the round of applause, but I shall raise my hands for everybody on everybody's behalf. And thank Andrew once again for a brilliant lecture, and hope that we will see our audience again at the next event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.